The war had been over for less than a year, but Germany still looked as if it had ended yesterday. Cities were flattened, bridges twisted into rivers, and every wall carried the marks of fire. Amid the ruins, a quiet and unexpected story began to take shape. American soldiers stationed across occupied Germany were filing requests not for new operations, but for marriage permissions. Within months, what had once been unthinkable became routine. Thousands of German women were preparing to leave their homeland, not as refugees, but as wives of the very men who had once worn the uniforms of an occupying army. By late 1946, the U.S. War Department began approving these unions under the War Brides Act, a new law that allowed foreign spouses of American servicemen to immigrate without the usual quotas. In less than 4 years, over 40,000 German women crossed the Atlantic. Their journey began in ruins and ended in the middle of Main Street parades. It was a transformation so abrupt that newspapers of the time called it a miracle of reconciliation. For the women themselves, it felt more like a collision between two worlds that could not be more different. They left cities still running on blackout schedules, where electricity failed nightly and bread was rationed to ounces, and arrived in American towns where light spilled from shop windows and grocery shelves seemed endless. Many had never tasted bananas or coffee that wasn't mixed with barley substitutes. Some had never seen a refrigerator. Yet, within days of arrival, they were being greeted by brass bands, waving children, and the smell of freshly baked pies carried by neighbors they had never met. In hundreds of small towns, the arrival of a German war bride was treated as a local event. Veterans groups organized homecoming parades, complete with flags, flowers, and homemade banners that read, "Welcome Home," or "Love Crosses Oceans." School bands played marches, and entire neighborhoods gathered outside train stations and docks to see the newcomers. Local papers often published photographs of smiling couples under headlines like, "Ex-enemy becomes our neighbor," or "From ruins to romance." The United States, emerging from wartime austerity into post-war prosperity, had rediscovered its optimism, and these women, arriving from a defeated and devastated Europe, became living proof that even the ashes of war could be turned into something hopeful. But for the brides themselves, the experience bordered on surreal. They had grown up under air raids, hunger, and propaganda that described Americans as invaders without mercy. Now the same Americans handed them flowers and sang welcome songs. In letters home, many wrote of the overwhelming abundance that surrounded them. One described entering a supermarket for the first time and freezing in place, unable to move past the first aisle. The sheer number of products, cans, fruits, soaps, colors, seemed almost unreal. Another remembered the sound of the cash register as the most foreign noise she had ever heard. They compared the cleanliness of American streets to the bomb craters of their home cities, and the noise of school marching bands to the sound of falling bombs they could still hear in their dreams. It was not just a change of place, but of tempo, rhythm, and meaning. The term used later by historians was culture whiplash. Life in Germany in 1946 was measured by scarcity. Coal shortages meant families heated single rooms while the rest of their homes remained cold. Women washed clothes by hand in basins and cooked with rationed fat or powdered milk. Trains ran sporadically through destroyed infrastructure, and a journey of 50 miles could take half a day. In contrast, their first weeks in America felt like living inside a world of motion and noise. Cars gleamed under neon lights, jukeboxes played endlessly in diners, and children ran freely without fear of air raid sirens. The simple act of walking through a department store could feel like a dream sequence. Even the smell of coffee, butter, and gasoline was intoxicating. Yet beneath the excitement lay confusion. Many brides struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. American culture emphasized optimism, politeness, and constant cheerfulness. For women coming from years of trauma and loss, that brightness could feel almost aggressive. They smiled for photographs beside new husbands in uniform, but described in private letters the quiet shock of seeing churches intact, schools open, and towns where nothing had been destroyed. The sound of laughter, the bright lights of nighttime streets, these were luxuries as alien as any foreign language. Local families often treated them with a mixture of fascination and pride. Hosting a German war bride became a civic gesture of reconciliation. Churches organized receptions, women's clubs collected clothes, and neighbors competed to host dinners. One New Jersey community even staged a parade with a float labeled "From Berlin to Main Street." The symbolism was clear. The war was over, and love had conquered its memory. In small-town America, that message mattered deeply. These gestures were not orchestrated by government policy, but by everyday citizens who wanted to turn victory into peace. For the women, the pageantry was both kind and bewildering. They had no frame of reference for being celebrated. In Germany, weddings after the war were small, practical affairs, often held in basements or ruined churches with borrowed rings and rationed sugar. In America, they found themselves the center of public celebrations, sometimes with hundreds of strangers watching. Accounts from archives describe brides being paraded down main streets in borrowed convertibles, local bands playing "Here Comes the Bride," and townsfolk lining the sidewalks to wave. Many cried from embarrassment rather than joy. They had never been cheered before. Behind the photographs and news stories, however, daily adaptation was difficult. Most brides arrived speaking little or no English. Their American husbands often returned to work or study under the GI Bill, leaving them alone in a world that functioned entirely in another language. They learned to measure American life by new ritual shopping lists, grocery coupons, PTA meetings. Some adopted the rhythm quickly, blending into local communities. Others remained isolated, writing home about loneliness in a land that seemed too bright, too fast, too different. The gap between German austerity and American prosperity was visible even in the smallest details. In letters preserved in the U.S. National Archives, brides described the shock of seeing pets fed with canned meat when their families in Europe still lived on barley soup. They wrote about lawns trimmed weekly, shoes polished daily, and children who owned multiple pairs of clothes. "It is a world of plenty," one bride wrote, "and I do not yet know how to live in it." Churches played a critical role in softening this transition. In the late 1940s, Protestant and Catholic congregations organized integration committees to help foreign wives adjust. Ministers gave sermons framing these marriages as proof of divine forgiveness and renewal. In many towns, the local church became the first place where the brides were publicly accepted as members of the community rather than as former enemies. The message was simple. The past was finished. The future was shared. Yet privately, many still carried the memory of ruins. Diaries describe women hanging laundry under clear skies, but feeling uneasy because silence reminded them of the calm before air raids. Others saved leftovers compulsively, unable to throw away food. The habit of scarcity clashed with a culture built on abundance. American neighbors noticed and called it frugality. The women knew it as survival. Even the taste of food felt unfamiliar. Margarine, canned vegetables, and processed bread were luxuries by post-war European standards, but they lacked the handmade texture of what little the women had cooked at home. They adapted recipes, replacing scarcity with plenty, learning to bake pies that fed entire neighborhoods instead of one family. Food became a symbolic language between the two worlds, a way to thank, to belong, and to remember. Communities responded with genuine enthusiasm. Newspapers from Wisconsin, Kansas, and Ohio frequently covered international weddings and new citizens from Germany, highlighting not the war's memory, but its supposed healing. Mayors gave speeches about reconciliation, and local veterans' posts adopted their former enemies' wives as honorary members of the community. In these small towns, history was rewritten at the level of ordinary gestures, handshakes, dances, Sunday dinners. The German brides stood at the center of this rewriting, their presence transforming abstract peace treaties into lived reality. The scale of their migration went largely unnoticed at first. Passenger manifests from 1946 to 1950 show weekly sailings of ships like the SS Washington, the SS America, and the USAT General Black, transporting hundreds of women and children from Bremerhaven to New York. Each arrival was met by officials from the Red Cross, immigration officers, and volunteers who helped them board trains to scattered destinations across the country. Most were bound not for big cities, but for small towns in the Midwest and South, places their husbands had come from, where factories, farms, and schools now flourished under post-war prosperity. The transformation they experienced could be measured statistically as well as emotionally. In Germany in 1946, the average home had less than 1 kilowatt of electrical consumption per day. In the United States, the figure exceeded 20. The calorie intake difference was nearly double. Infant mortality in the American Midwest was less than 1/10 of what it was in the ruins of Berlin or Hamburg. Every number confirmed what their eyes already saw. They had crossed from scarcity to surplus. Yet, even as they were celebrated, not everyone welcomed them. Some Americans, especially older veterans and conservative groups, questioned these marriages, arguing that fraternization laws had existed for a reason. Newspaper editorials debated whether enemy wives could truly adapt. But in most communities, hospitality outweighed suspicion. The parades, receptions, and public displays of goodwill became tools of social integration. The small-town pageantry, the music, and the pie contests were less about celebration than about erasing doubt. Each event told the same story. The war was over, the enemy had become family. For the brides, this American ritual of welcome was both generous and overwhelming. They found themselves photographed beside mayors and marching bands, asked to wave for cameras while reporters noted their modest smiles and accented English. Many complied, still unsure how to feel. Years later, oral histories collected from these women reveal a shared sentiment that America welcomed them too loudly, too brightly, and too suddenly for them to process what was happening. They smiled because that was what was expected, but behind the smiles lingered disbelief. What they remembered most vividly was not the parade itself, but the silence that followed, the moment the crowd dispersed, and they stood in their new hometowns, realizing there was no way back. The journey from ruins to brass bands was complete, but understanding it would take years. In time, the culture shock faded, replaced by routine, citizenship papers, and children who spoke English as their first language. But the memory of that first arrival, the cars, the flags, the sound of trumpets echoing down streets untouched by war, remained the defining moment of their transformation. For women who had once walked through bombed-out cities, the experience of walking through a small American town during a wedding parade was more than celebration. It was proof that history could reverse itself, that a nation once destroyed could be embraced by the very people who defeated it, and that peace, when performed with sincerity and spectacle, could feel as unreal as war itself. 1946. The Allied occupation had turned Germany into a patchwork of administrative zones, checkpoints, and offices, where even small personal decisions required military approval. For American soldiers stationed across this landscape, marrying a German woman meant navigating a maze of paperwork that stretched from field headquarters to Washington. The U.S. Army had prohibited fraternization with former enemies until October 1945, and even after the ban was lifted, marriage remained tightly controlled. Every union required clearance from commanding officers, background checks by military intelligence, and approval from consular authorities. Yet within a year, what began as a trickle of requests became a flood. Thousands of soldiers applied for permission to marry German citizens, forcing both the army and local churches to create new systems to handle what officials called an administrative phenomenon of unexpected scale. The process began with Form 160, the application for permission to marry a foreign national. It required the soldier to provide his own service record, the prospective bride's birth certificate, evidence that she had no ties to the Nazi Party, and confirmation that neither had been previously married. Investigators from the Counterintelligence Corps often visited the woman's home, interviewed her neighbors, and confirmed that she was not using the marriage as a means of escape from prosecution or displacement. Only after receiving a security clearance could the couple schedule a civil ceremony. The U.S. military viewed these marriages as both personal and political acts. Each approval represented a small gesture of reconciliation, but also a public test of discipline in the occupation forces. The War Department issued strict guidelines. No marriage could proceed without a 3-month waiting period. No German spouse could travel to America until screened by both Army and immigration authorities, and all documentation had to pass through the Office of the Judge Advocate General. But the bureaucracy soon bent under its own weight. By mid-1946, American commands in Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg were processing hundreds of applications per month. To handle the overflow, local chaplains, clergy, and church councils stepped in, transforming the process from military formality into community partnership. In towns like Stuttgart, Bremen, and Frankfurt, Protestant and Catholic clergy organized marriage councils that worked directly with U.S. officers to speed verification of baptismal and birth records destroyed in bombing raids. Churches became unofficial intermediaries, certifying that couples met moral and legal standards when official German institutions still lay in ruins. It was an unusual alliance, pastors and colonels cooperating to rewrite post-war marriage law on the fly. American chaplains, many of whom had conducted battlefield funerals months earlier, now presided over wedding ceremonies between their own troops and former enemies. Army archives record that in the U.S. occupation zone alone, chaplains performed over 12,000 mixed nationality weddings between 1946 and 1949. They followed military regulations to the letter: 2 witnesses, both American, 1 interpreter, and a signed certificate approved by the local commanding officer. Photographs from those ceremonies show modest rooms draped with both American and German flags, the symbolism deliberate and heavy proof that moral reconstruction had begun. Civil authorities on both sides recognized the political potential of these unions. For the USD, they demonstrated the success of denazification through domestic integration. For the Germans, they represented survival and the restoration of normal life. Local registrars began fast-tracking paperwork for couples involving American servicemen. Where German civilians waited months for marriage licenses, war brides' documents often cleared in weeks. The logic was pragmatic. American marriages removed one dependent from the German ration system and provided an indirect form of relief. Every bride who left for America meant one fewer mouth to feed in a starving country. Bureaucratic pragmatism often disguised itself as goodwill. The War Brides Act of December 1945 transformed the process completely. The law allowed foreign spouses and children of U.S. servicemen to enter the United States outside of quota restrictions, bypassing immigration limits that would otherwise have delayed them for years. It was the first major U.S. immigration policy written explicitly for the aftermath of a war. Under its provisions, the State Department coordinated directly with the Army's Transport Command to schedule transatlantic voyages. Each ship manifest read like a registry of reconciliation. Hundreds of women from Germany, Italy, and Austria listed as dependents of U.S. personnel. The U.S. consulates in Frankfurt, Bremen, and Munich quickly became centers of marriage administration. American officers described them as marriage factories. Applicants queued for hours carrying folders of documents translated birth certificates, affidavits of good conduct, vaccination records, and evidence of moral character certified by both church and local mayor. The processing lines resembled military operations in miniature. Applicants passed through fingerprinting stations, medical examinations, and loyalty interviews before reaching the final approval desk. By late 1947, efficiency had replaced ceremony. The American embassy issued hundreds of visas per month, while the German local authorities learned to replicate the American filing system to speed approvals. The result was a bureaucratic rhythm unlike anything seen in Germany before, part military precision, part missionary zeal. Churches again played a vital role in bridging the administrative and moral gap. Pastors in both Lutheran and Catholic parishes held crash courses for couples, teaching English phrases, basic American customs, and the legal requirements for civil registration abroad. American chaplains worked with German priests to translate marriage certificates into dual-language forms accepted by both legal systems. The cooperation went beyond paperwork. Joint services began appearing across the occupation zones, weddings conducted in bombed-out churches with bilingual sermons and shared prayers for peace. To the Army, these events symbolized successful re-education. To the clergy, they were acts of pastoral necessity. The effect was practical as much as symbolic. Every such ceremony generated paperwork instantly valid on both sides of the Atlantic, shortening waiting periods by months. One of the most decisive innovations was the creation of the Provisional Marriage Clearance. Introduced by the U.S. Army in late 1946, it allowed soldiers with pending applications to marry locally before the full approval from Washington arrived. The regulation, designed to prevent desertion and disciplinary problems caused by delayed marriages, effectively legalized hundreds of unions retroactively once clearances were confirmed. This compromise turned the tide. By 1947, the bureaucratic bottleneck had been broken. The combination of church cooperation, streamlined military forms, and diplomatic coordination had turned what once required 6 months into a process often completed in 6 weeks. Officially, every case still followed the rules. Unofficially, everyone involved bent them slightly to make the system work. For many brides, the first sign of success was not a wedding ring, but a transit document, the Dependents Travel Authorization. It was issued only after the marriage was recognized by both governments. This single sheet of paper determined everything. permission to leave the country, eligibility for transport on U.S. Army ships, and the right to enter the United States as a lawful spouse. The forms bore multiple seals, American, Allied, and local German, and were often treasured more carefully than passports. Church offices kept duplicate copies, ensuring no bride would lose her chance if military records went missing. The coordination between military logistics and moral authority became so efficient that journalists later called it bureaucratic mercy. Soldiers wrote to the Army Times praising chaplains who processed their paperwork faster than any clerk. German pastors proudly noted that marriages between American troops and local women were conducted with more scrutiny than any pre-war ceremony, but with far greater speed. Each approval, stamped and signed, represented not only a personal victory, but a political message. Reconciliation was now policy. Immigration to the United States remained the final and most symbolic step. After clearance, brides were instructed to report to staging centers at Bremerhaven or Frankfurt. There they received medical screenings, orientation lectures, and brief lessons on American customs. Red Cross workers distributed English dictionaries and pamphlets titled "Welcome to the United States." Army chaplains held farewell services, reminding the women that they were now ambassadors of peace. Every detail, from the type of visa to the ship's schedule, reflected the coordination of military and moral institutions working toward the same goal: to transform private love into an official bridge between nations. On arrival in New York, immigration officers at Pier 84 greeted the incoming ships not with interrogation, but with ceremony. Bands played, photographers waited, and representatives of the American Red Cross escorted the brides to trains bound for every region of the country. At that moment, the paper trail that began in German ruins ended in the heart of the American domestic ideal. The rules that had once separated conqueror from conquered had been rewritten into a system designed for unity. The transformation was as bureaucratic as it was cultural. Where once soldiers required permission to speak to German civilians, they now received commendations for marrying them. Where once churches had condemned fraternization, they now performed bilingual ceremonies under banners reading, "From War to Peace." What had begun as a cautious experiment in controlled reconciliation became one of the most successful administrative programs of the post-war era. Between 1946 and 1950, more than 40,000 German women were granted visas under the War Brides Act, and over 90% of those marriages remained intact 5 years later, a statistic that stunned policymakers who had feared scandal and failure. The efficiency of the system inspired similar frameworks in Japan and Korea during later occupations. What made it work was not sentiment but structure, an unprecedented alliance between military regulation, religious institutions, and immigration policy. Each step form, signature, blessing, visa was designed to move faster than memory, to transform enemies into spouses before politics could intervene. By 1949, the procedures were so refined that newly assigned soldiers in Germany joked that the chaplain's office works like a wedding factory. And in a sense, it did. Every ceremony, every clearance, every visa carried the same implicit message. Peace was no longer a treaty. It was a document you could sign, stamp, and board a ship with. The small print on those forms told the story better than any headline. Marriage to a foreign national approved under Army Regulation 600 and 240. Valid for transport to the United States, subject to moral and health examination, no restrictions. Between the ruins of Europe and the parades of America, it was these lines of text typed by clerks, verified by chaplains, and sealed by consulates that turned post-war romance into history. 1947. The first transports of German war brides were arriving in the United States with military precision ships carrying hundreds of women, their belongings packed into regulation trunks marked Dependent U.S. Army. They disembarked at New York's Pier 84, met by reporters, Red Cross volunteers, and curious onlookers who had come to see what reconciliation looked like. To the public, they were symbols of peace and domestic normalcy. To themselves, they were stepping into a world that defied everything they had known. Their letters home became the most honest record of this transformation. Thousands survive in archives and family collections, written in careful handwriting on Red Cross stationery or American notepads embossed with hotel names. They describe, in quiet astonishment, the texture of a new life, one defined not by destruction, but by excess. "I thought the lights would go out at night," one wrote to her mother in Hamburg. "But they never do. There's electricity even in the bathroom. The milk is cold, always cold." Another, from Minnesota, confessed, "I cannot stop opening the refrigerator. It hums like a machine in a dream. There is meat, butter, and glass bottles of milk. I touch everything just to see if it's real." The open fridge became a recurring image in these letters, a shorthand for America itself, bright, humming, endless, and impossible to empty. These women, many of whom had grown up amid ruins, were suddenly living inside the post-war American promise: suburban houses, supermarkets, and family dinners under fluorescent light. The adjustment was as psychological as it was cultural. German brides had learned to survive on ration cards and scavenging. Now they were expected to plan weekly grocery trips and throw dinner parties. Their first photographs in America capture that shock more clearly than words. Women in plain European coats standing in front of supermarket displays, half smiling, half terrified. Rows of canned goods extended behind them like a hallucination of order. These images appeared in local newspapers as evidence of assimilation. Our new neighbors discover American shopping. But to the women themselves, they recorded a deeper dislocation. Every shelf of food was also a reminder of what had been lost, of the emptiness left behind in Europe. In their letters, the sensory overload is constant. "The air smells of gasoline and baking bread," one bride wrote from Ohio in 1948. "The cars never stop, the stores never close, and people never whisper." Another wrote to her sister in Hanover, "Children here do not fear planes. When they see one, they wave." That single observation summarized the entire emotional distance between their old and new worlds. For those who had spent their childhoods diving into basements at the sound of engines, watching American children point to the sky without fear was almost incomprehensible. Daily life itself became a kind of schooling. Many brides had studied English only through brief army-run classes or through their husbands' explanations. Their grammar was uncertain, their accents thick, but they learned quickly because they had to. Everyday survival required communication with postmen, grocers, and neighbors. Letters home document this learning curve. "I have learned how to say 'change please' at the store," one wrote, "and to smile even when I do not understand the question." Smiling became a survival skill, a universal translator in a country where politeness was a social currency. The greatest shock came not from technology or architecture, but from behavior. American openness neighbors introducing themselves, strangers offering rides, clerks asking, "How are you?" felt intrusive at first. "People here talk to you as if they have known you forever," one letter complained, "but they do not mean it. They are friendly but not curious. They speak quickly and forget you by the next day." Others found this rhythm comforting. "No one asks about the war," another woman wrote, "and that is a blessing. They do not want to hear your story, and that makes it easier to forget." For many, forgetting was part of survival. The letters rarely mention the war directly. Instead, they record moments of sensory contrast: fresh bread instead of rationed black loaves, paved streets instead of rubble, laughter instead of silence. "I hear no sirens," one bride noted, "only radios playing music." In their new homes, sound itself became a measure of peace: the ticking of electric clocks, the whir of fans, the rhythm of trains. All these noises replaced the thunder of bombers. Some women wrote that they slept badly at first because America was too quiet in the countryside or too bright in cities that never dimmed their lights. The concept of uninterrupted electricity, of light available on demand, was as alien as any language barrier. Photography became another way to translate the experience. Many war brides sent rolls of film back to Germany, showing themselves in kitchens, at church events, or pushing baby strollers through snow-covered streets. These photos were proof of safety, prosperity, and acceptance. They were also propaganda of peace in miniature visual evidence that ordinary life had resumed. "We take pictures of everything," one wrote. "They will not believe us otherwise." Cameras, bought with husbands' military pay, became instruments of diplomacy. Each photo of a smiling couple beside a new refrigerator or a decorated Christmas tree was a personal treaty of reconciliation, proof that the war's survivors could live normal lives. Yet beneath the optimism ran a current of unease. Many brides described loneliness that no abundance could cure. "Everyone is kind, but no one understands me," one wrote from Pennsylvania. "I speak and they smile, but they do not hear what I mean." Cultural distance remained constant even when material comfort erased hardship. Some avoided German communities, fearing suspicion or prejudice. Others sought them out, forming small circles of women who met weekly to cook traditional food, exchange language tips, and share letters from home. They called themselves Kaffeeklatsch clubs, a term that appeared in local newspapers as a sign of cheerful integration, but in truth provided the only space where they could speak freely in their native tongue. Religion also became a bridge. Churches, the same institutions that had once handled their marriage paperwork, now shaped their emotional adaptation. Protestant and Catholic congregations in the United States invited war brides into women's circles, Sunday schools, and charity drives. They found comfort in familiar rituals, candles, hymns, confession, even when conducted in English. Pastors wrote in parish newsletters about the quiet dignity of our new European members, turning private adjustment into public virtue. The integration was real, but it came with expectations, gratitude, humility, and silence about the past. Most complied. Their letters showed deep respect for their new communities, but rarely mentioned the destruction of their old ones. The image of the refrigerator appears again and again in these writings, not merely as a symbol of plenty, but as an emblem of discipline. To have food and not to eat at all is the hardest thing, one woman confessed. I open the door just to make sure it is still there. For a generation raised in scarcity, the American kitchen represented both salvation and anxiety. They hoarded canned goods, froze leftovers, and saved wrapping paper, habits that puzzled their new neighbors but made perfect sense to anyone who had survived hunger. The abundance was real, but trust in it took years to develop. First-generation children later recalled their mother's fascination with order pantries arranged by type, calendars marked with ration-like precision, and an almost sacred respect for food. They grew up hearing the same story repeated in different forms. When we came here, we could not believe how much there was. The mothers rarely spoke of the war, but they spoke endlessly of that first visit to a supermarket, that first sound of a humming refrigerator, that first sense of safety measured not in walls or armies, but in the ability to choose what to eat. These small domestic details became the foundation of their American identity. The letters reveal a gradual transformation from guest to citizen. Early letters were signed, "Your Daughter in America," but within a few years, signatures changed to "Your Daughter, now American." The shift was linguistic, but also emotional. By the early 1950s, many had stopped writing altogether. Communication with Germany slowed as new families grew, mortgages replaced remittances, and children began school. Assimilation happened quietly, through birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, and PTA meetings. The women who once stood in front of bombed cathedrals now stood in front of white wooden churches, their German accents fading with each passing year. Historians studying these letters note the absence of bitterness. The war brides did not romanticize America, but they rarely criticized it. Their tone is factual, pragmatic, and sometimes dryly humorous. "The washing machine sounds like an airplane," one woman joked, "but it is better to fly laundry than bombs." Another wrote, "The neighbors bring pies, I bring sauerkraut, we are learning diplomacy." The humor masked exhaustion, but also resilience. Having survived the collapse of one world, they adapted to another with the same practicality that had carried them through the ruins. By the late 1940s, the U.S. government began collecting testimonials from these women for immigration studies. One survey asked what had surprised them most about America. The top answers were not freedom or wealth, but cleanliness, safety, and refrigeration. When asked what they missed most about Germany, the answers were not politics or ideology, but quiet, bread baked in wood ovens, and people who spoke slowly. The contrast between their two lives was summarized by one anonymous respondent. "In Germany, we had memories but no future. Here we have a future, but no memories." The voices of the German war brides, preserved in thousands of letters, photographs, and oral histories, form a mosaic of post-war reality rarely seen in official reports. They describe not battles or treaties, but the intimate mechanics of peace, the sound of a refrigerator, the click of a camera, the rustle of a supermarket bag. They turn these ordinary details into anchors of belonging. In their kitchens, the Cold War began not with ideology, but with the steady hum of American technology and the slow disappearance of fear. By the mid-1950s, most of them had become citizens. They voted, joined local clubs, and sent their children to American schools. Yet even decades later, when interviewed for documentaries and memoirs, they spoke of that first moment in the supermarket, that first open fridge, as the instant they truly understood the distance they had traveled from hunger to plenty, from rubble to rhythm, from enemies to neighbors. In the end, their legacy was not political, but human. They proved that peace could be measured not only in treaties or parades, but in the quiet, everyday miracle of opening a refrigerator and knowing it would still be full tomorrow.